Good evening. Set, sun, we humbly pray. O sun goddess, in prophecy thou told us of the holy anti-Keogh, UFO Mary, who, as we all know, will be the greatest space pirate who ever lived, who will bring about the end of the flying saucer era. After that, thou revealed to us in thy endless wisdom, there will be a sky butterfly age. Around a century or two from now, people will start reporting butterflies in the sky, which will mystify everyone. Will they be giant or telepathic? Nobody knows. But people will report them all over the world, and they will somehow be both physically there and not simultaneously. For millennia, researchers will puzzle over these sky butterflies, hiding countless mysteries nested inside of each other. Meanwhile, everything else will keep going on. The butterflies won't provide answers to our problems like a UFO Mary type figure. They'll just be there, along with everything else. But we'll learn many things from the butterflies over many generations by watching the skies. The sky butterfly age will be a time of global peace and justice for humans, nature, and land spirits. But the human race will face a new challenge called Skadankorax. Thus, the sky butterfly age will proceed for 10,000 years till the great flying flower age, which in about 100,000 years' time is followed by the 10 psychic vortex ages. Sun goddess, we call upon thee that thy prophecies will be fulfilled sooner rather than later. May no butterfly sunset be the last butterfly sunset. Amen. It's a big news week for foam fanatics everywhere, all one of us. And when will we finally get flying foam disclosure? Plus, what is the deal with UFOs allegedly monkeying with military equipment? Are flying saucers basically just telekinetic flying gremlins? Yes. And do you smell something? Well, unfortunately, it's probably just something in your place, because my apologies, but I must delay my sulfur piece yet again. Instead, the secret word for tonight is the. So whenever you lovely viewers at home hear the word the during the program, say boop. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
Jeff Knox.
Luis Cayetano.
Welcome to UFO Sunset. And now for Foam in the News, a rebrief special report on human-created foam pollutants. Debris from a giant wind turbine blade washed ashore in Nantucket. The debris from a 350-foot-long blade of an offshore wind turbine was found by locals on the beaches of Nantucket in July, inciting public controversy. This debris was largely composed of fiberglass and plastic foams, including both polyethylene foam and polyvinyl chloride, or PVC foam. The turbine is part of the Vineyard 1 offshore wind farm in the Gulf of Maine, which GE Vernova was in the process of manufacturing earlier this year. On August 6th, the company submitted a second quarter filing to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. In it, they reported having completed 24 of 62 offshore turbines. On July 15th, the U.S. Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, or BSEE, ordered that both power production and construction at the wind farm be ceased until there's an investigation. According to GE Vernova's CEO, Scott Strazik, there was a, quote, material deviation or a manufacturing deviation, unquote, according to the Portland Press Herald. Brooke Moore, the chair of the Nantucket Select Board, as well as Representative William Keating, a Democrat serving Nantucket's district, both criticized the BSEE for a 2-day delay in being notified of the wind turbine failure. According to the Washington Post, environmental activist Talon Brienne has also questioned the environmental impacts of wind turbines, even while being fully opposed to fossil fuels. At the same time, Maine officials and project developers are in negotiations surrounding a proposed wind turbine research array. And in related news, locals in Grand Meadow in the southeastern Minnesota complain of over 100 fiberglass turbine blades abandoned on an unused lot in 2020, the Minnesota Star Tribune reported. These blades were made by Next Era, which went out of business before they could be recycled. Trucks abandoned these blades next to the property of Darcy Richardson, who complained of it spoiling her view and her plans to build a garden patio. The lot beside Richardson's home is leased by a company called River Cap Ventures, who were originally responsible for recycling the blades. But Next Era went out of business, resulting in the blades still being there today. A polystyrene factory is to shut down by the end of the year. On Wednesday, Styropek announced that they're tentatively planning to shut down their plastic factory in the town of Monica, Pennsylvania, at the end of the year. Styropek is a company with 6 factories and a distribution network across North and South America. They manufacture beads of polystyrene plastic, which are used in the production of plastic foams for packing, such as styrofoam. Last year, environmental activist groups Penn Environment Incorporated and Three Rivers Waterkeeper filed a lawsuit against Styropek USA along with a company called BVPV Styrenics LLC, citing violations of the Clean Water Act. Three Rivers Waterkeeper helped to document large amounts of plastic beads called nurdles in the Ohio River and in Raccoon Creek, tracing them to the Styropek factory. According to a special to the Beaver County Times by Chrissy Suttles, Styropek claims that their decision to shut down the factory is unrelated to the lawsuit. They also said they plan to move in a more sustainable direction by discontinuing styrofoam food packaging products. With the shutting down of the Monica factory, they will also be discontinuing 2 lines of products, including their cup line and their Arcel line. A foam flood spilled out of the sides of a Coast Guard hangar. Last Sunday, a hangar at the U.S. Coast Guard Aviation Training Center in Mobile, Alabama, was flooded with foam. The expanding foam was intended to put out fires, but according to Lieutenant Earl Roberts, the foam was released due to a quote-unquote fault in the system. Although there was no fire-related emergency in the hangar, the fire alarm was triggered somehow. There were 7 aircraft in the hangar at the time, including 3 HC-144 Ocean Sentry planes and 4 MH-60 Jayhawk helicopters, ABC 27 News reported. And for a brief update on solar weather. Last Sunday, we reported on aurora forecasts during the peak of the Perseid meteor shower that night. At the time, spaceweather.com forecast mild to moderate solar storms. In fact, the solar storms on last Sunday and Monday exceeded expectations, being rated as G3 and G4, or strong to severe. The aurora was observed as far south as Texas. Another strong storm hit Earth on Saturday night after an X-class flare from sunspot AR 3784, which is thought to be more likely to produce flares because its polarity is at 90 degrees to most flares. But the aurora storm was not as visible as it mostly occurred during daylight hours. More activity is expected from the sunspot AR 3790. Experts also anticipate that the increased auroral activity that we've been witnessing this year is expected to continue in 2025. And now over to you, Jeff.
Today, we are going to be talking about the Minot Air Force Base Mike 6 Minuteman launch site incident that took place on October 24th through 25th. It was take place over the night in 1966 near Carpio or Granito, North Dakota. Now, this is not the more famous Minot site that incident that took place in October 1968 that people have probably heard me mention a lot. So keep that in mind. This took place almost 2 years earlier in North Dakota. Now, during the 1950s, the Cold War was heating up, and American military leaders feared the possible threat of a northern attack over the Arctic by enemy bomber planes. Recognizing this threat, they sought to find possible sites for radar stations and military bases in the northern tier states bordering Canada. And if people have heard of the Northern Tier incidents, it's a set of other sites around incidents around missile sites that happened in 1975 in kind of these northern states bordering Canada. And one of these long-range defense radar stations, constructed as part of the Air Defense Command's permanent network, was established south of Minot, North Dakota, in May 1951. Minot Air Force Station was actually the first major Air Force installation in North Dakota, predating the two larger bases, Minot Air Force Base and the Grand Forks Air Force Base. Now, in 1954, the city of Minot sold the Air Force on becoming the site for a new fighter interceptor base. The following year, the local businessmen and citizens would donate $50,000 to buy the initial land for the base, and construction of the new facility would begin in May 1956. Officially activated as a base on January 10th, 1957, Minot Air Force Base became an Air Defense Command base until the first permanent Strategic Air Command unit was activated there in 1958. In 1961, the Air Force selected the land around Minot for a new Minuteman I intercontinental ballistic missile complex. Construction of the missile sites commenced in January 1962, and by July, command of Minot Air Force Base had passed from the Air Defense Command to the Strategic Air Command, as the base's primary mission changed from becoming an air defense station to strategic deterrence. Now, the Strategic Air Command activated the 455th Strategic Missile Wing in November 1962. This wing would later be renamed and redesignated the 91st Strategic Missile Wing in June of 1968. So in later cases, like the later Minot cases, they talk about the 91st Missile Wing. It's essentially the same wing. It was just renamed. Now, in less than a year, on September 9th, 1963, the very first Minuteman I missiles arrived from Hill Air Force Base in Utah. Within 28 months, in April 1964, the 455th became combat ready. The fields in North Dakota were now implanted with over 150 silos, 10 launch complexes spread out over 12,000 square miles, ready to defend this country with a nuclear response if necessary. Now, an interesting side note, I guess, is that the Amtrak, when Amtrak, the train used to stop through the town, the conductor used to give them a little bit of history, and he would tell people that if North Dakota succeeded from the Union, it would become the third largest nuclear power in the world. They would have they'd be basically like right behind the U.S. and Russia for nuclear weapons because North Dakota has so many nuclear weapons and silos there. And not only do they have all these silos, Minot Air Force Base is not just one part of the nuclear triad. The nuclear triad, if people are not familiar, is you've got your ICBMs, you've got your nuclear submarines, and you've got your strategic nuclear bombers. And Minot basically is two parts of the nuclear triad. Not only do they have this very large intercontinental ballistic missile facility fields, they also were home base to B-52 nuclear strategic bombers. And so they basically had two parts of the nuclear triad going on in Minot. And it was one of the larger bases, actually. So many people and stuff worked in the Minot Air Force Base area. Out of all 49 strategic air command bases, it was one of the largest in the United States. Now, to kind of get onto our actual, some background for you for the area, this Mike 6 incident took place about 7 months before the more famous Malmstrom Air Force Base shutdown case. That would be the Echo incident on March 16th, or if you believe the Robert Salas story, on March 24th. We'll get into that later. But this event happened about 7 months before that, and it's another incident involving a Minuteman missile system adversely affected during what was a radar visual sighting of a UFO in the missile fields in Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota. This August 24th through August 25th, 1966 case is documented in the Air Force Project Blue Book files and was investigated by Project Blue Book investigator J. Allen Hynek. He would later popularize the case in a December 1966 article titled "Are UFOs Real?" in the Saturday Evening Press. It was also investigated by Robert Lowe, Condon Committee Project Coordinator, who was involved in investigating the last case I did, the Alvin Moore case. He investigated this case with Hynek, and this case would be listed as Case 9 in the Condon Project's final report. In fact, in the Blue Book documents, it was suggested that this case could be the case that kind of kicks off the Condon Project's, investigation into the topic. And I don't know if that was specifically the case or not, but it was Case 9 in the final report. But unlike other missile incidents, this one does not involve the shutdown of any nuclear missiles. In this incident, communications between a launch control facility, otherwise known as an LCF, and those nowadays are called MAFs, missile alert facilities. They changed the terminology, and I believe 1992, in the 90s anyways. But there's a launch control facility, or the MAF, and the base command post, and there was static between the mobile strike alert team sent to investigate the UFO and the flight security controller at the LCF. And so the communications were apparently interrupted by static. Now, like many sightings that take place over these missile fields, this case actually takes place over an abnormally long period of time, approximately 3.5 to 4 hours. And it involves multiple observers at widely separated distances and sites, with supposed confirmation by multiple radar systems. Now, on August 24th, this is the night, at 10 p.m., Airman 3rd Class Michael D. Mueller of the 862nd Combat Support Squadron is walking his post at the missile site Mike 6, which is the launch flight Mike 6. Those are the unmanned launch facilities that are underground with the actual missiles. And these security patrols, basically secure the area. And so he's out walking on his post when he witnesses a luminous shape about 45 degrees elevation in the northern sky. Now, the other guy that with him says 40 degrees, and that it actually varied between 0 degrees and 55 degrees. But so this object he sees exhibits limited lateral motion, and it always seems to come back to its original position. The object continually changed color from green to red to blue in turn. It seemed dim in relation to the stars. The guard, frightened, wakes his partner, Airman 3rd Class John M. Turner, who is due to relieve him in about an hour's time at about 11 p.m. They both watch the object for a while. Now, very few witnesses were able to actually discern any distinct shape to the object. Airman Turner had reported that when the object had moved in front of the cloud, he could see the changing colored lights, and they appeared to come from behind the object, and they kind of reflected against these clouds, created a silhouette. And he described the object as being round on top and bottom. A sketch of this object was drawn by Turner and is included in the Air Force files, and you can see it kind of on the slide here. Now, meanwhile, their captain, who they reported the site to over the base radio, sends out a strike team to the Mike 6 site and alerts the South Base radar crew, which is the Minot Air Force Station. By the time the strike team reached Mike 6 at about 11:20 p.m., and this is approximate, the problem we have with kind of reconstructing the timeline is we only kind of have approximate dates from the log of when these people showed up at the various times. We don't have like down to the minute or accurate sighting times for the actual when they saw the objects, etc. But the strike team basically arrives at 11:20 p.m. and the original object supposedly is gone. They don't see it. However, they and several other men notice one or more yellowish white objects very low on the southeastern horizon in the direction of the airstrip of Minot Air Force Base. That's roughly 50 miles in the distance. Now, reports do state that actually, so this strike team was led by this guy, Airman Second Class Holiday, and he supposedly briefly did actually see that first object that was seen by Mueller and Turner. So when he was driving to the site in their Jeep or whatever their control vehicle, security vehicle they were using at the time, they were watching a white light, the white light as they approached the site. They could not see this, what was referred to as an unusually bright object that Mueller and Turner saw. Turner would point it out to Holiday when they arrived, who apparently did briefly see it at about 20 degrees elevation, not 45 or 40, but only about 20 degrees elevation, before he went back to returning to watch the white light again. He would later briefly try to find that first light again that Turner and Mueller saw, but he could not see it and returned to looking at the white light. The guys that were with him, his rider, Airman Third Class Aldrich, did not see the first object at all. He only heard Mueller, Turner, and that Holiday kind of briefly mentioned it. And that's kind of thing is like some of the people that were out there didn't even see these alleged objects. So they only saw the one object at the time. And this is kind of it's a later photo of a security crew kind of from Warren Air Force Base. But these are kind of the security alert teams. And they kind of patrol the area. Now, roughly the same time, at the same time, the security squadron arrives out there and they see these white objects. The 786th Radar Squadron reports that the base radar detects the objects 95 miles out on their search radar and at about 100,000 feet altitude. The object appears to be larger than a B-52. Now, I'll point out this 100,000 feet thing is mentioned in multiple places and a lot of the literature about the case. And it is mentioned like once in the AFR 200-2 report, but it kind of contradicts what the radar logs later say. The radar logs say that they don't actually have, that they only assumed the object that was that high. And when the base contacted South Base in order to kind of get a track on, to figure out the height of the target, they were informed that the radar doesn't actually work at that height and they couldn't tell them a height at that target. Then so I'm not sure that it ever really was tracked at 100,000 feet. At least it wasn't by the South Base radar as implied. But so as this thing is being tracked, rising and descending a number of times, it actually supposedly it rises between 2,000 to 8,000 feet. And as it's doing this, each time Major Chester A. Shaw, who is in charge of the Mike 6 missile crew, finds his radio transmissions are being interrupted by static, even though he's 60 feet underground in one of these launch kind of control consoles. And to kind of get a better idea of how these radar systems work out there, they are basically using what's called kind of two-dimensional radar, not three-dimensional radar. So they had two different systems they would have to use in conjunction. They used what was called a search radar. And a search radar was essentially like a fence. It would look out in all 360 directions, and it could tell you the direction it picks up a target, and it could tell you a distance, but it couldn't tell you a height or any of that other information. So they would use that in combination with what's called a height finder radar. Now, a height finder radar, and this base was specifically using what was called the AN FPS 90. which is actually an updated version of an older radar called the FPS-6. And these height finder radars is once you have an azimuth, a direction that you know this target is coming, they target this height finder radar. And these are are what were referred to as nodding radars. They would basically mechanically nod up and down at that azimuth, looking for a target to try and figure out the height of it. And they would plot it on what was called a range height indicator plot, which essentially on the x-axis had the distance from the radar set, and on the y-axis had the height. And you would get a little plot there, and they could put a cursor on it, and it would give them a readout of the height. And in combination with what they got from the search radar, they could kind of figure out a three-dimensional coordinate of the direction and the height and range to these targets. And this is essentially what the scopes look like. That's actually an older model than they would have used. That would have been used like with an FPS-6. On the left there with your standard range height indicator. And on the right is perhaps the more recognizable, what's called a PPI, plan position indicator plot. And that's basically your 360 sweep that you see that goes around in circles, and you see the little blips pick up on it. Now, so more specifically what happened is South Base had been called saying, hey, we're picking up this target at 95 miles at about 357 degrees azimuth. Can you tell us the height? They pick up the target at about 355 degrees azimuth, 95 miles, and they pick up this height at about 2,400 feet. Later, they pick it up at about 4,400 feet, and it changes altitude every so often. It was observed going, like I said, between 2,400 feet and 8,200 feet altitude, but it didn't vary in azimuth by more than a degree or two. And the range of 95 miles per hour never changed. It was always at 95 miles per hour, always in the same direction. So this object was essentially hovering in the same place, except for the radar showing it changing in altitude a little bit. But unlike the 100,000 feet, their radar only ever picked it up from 2,400 to about 8,000 something feet. Now, at this time, as the strike team reports the UFO begins to kind of swoop and dive, and it appears to land about 10 to 15 miles south of Mike 6. And elsewhere in the literature, it says south of November 7th. Technically, they're sort of like next to each other, so depending on where it was, it could be both, I guess. But they see it land about 10 to 15 miles away from where they are at Mike 6. And they witness a glow from the area where the object appears to be. Now, Mike 6 site control sends a strike team to check on it. And when they get within 10 miles of the site, static interrupts their radio contact back with base. And 5 to 8 minutes later, the glow diminishes and the UFO takes off. Now, these two photos here, this is kind of the layout here of a base. This underground facility is what's called the launch control capsule. And this is where the missile officers are underground, roughly 60 to 80 feet or whatever underground. Above that is what's called the launch control support building that provides support to the people that are below ground. And this is a photo of the Mike 1 facility that they were located at. And this isn't the Mike 1 Launch Control Center, but it's just a generic image of what these underground capsules look like that they were stationed in for, I believe, 24 hours at a time. They had a 24-hour kind of like duty that they were stuck down there in these capsules underground. And so this guy is underground, and he's getting static between him and the strike team that he sent out to investigate this site, investigate this glowing object that they saw potentially land. Now, at this time, another UFO is sighted by personnel, I believe the Mike 4 launch facility, and it's also tracked on radar. The first object flies underneath the second one, and the two objects disappear separately. The radar log actually reports that the white object went underneath the first object. So I don't know if they just kind of flipped that around, but it's kind of reported differently in different places. But basically, two of the objects, one object supposedly went under the other, and then they disappeared, one to the north, one to the south. Now, at 12:19 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the very first sighting, an F-106 interceptor was sent up by the 5th Fighter Interceptor Squadron out of Minot Air Force Base. The pilot of the fighter, his name was Captain Berg, was sent to intercept the radar target, and he reported reported that while he was guided by the radar crew, in this case, Staff Sergeant Angel Kamako and Airman First Class Adele, guided him to this target using the search and height finder radars. Adele was running the height finder radar, and Kamako was running the search radar. And they targeted him in on this target. And he flew in on this target, and he flew over the target at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000 feet. So if you recall, the radar targets they were picking up, they saw this object kind of like at these different 1,000 feet elevations. And so they send this guy out, and he flies in circular patterns at all these different elevations trying to pick up the target. Unfortunately, and while the radar verified the plane passed through essentially or very near the target, the pilot made no visual contact. So looking on this radar plot, it was what I believe is called a merge plot. Like you could not really distinguish between their plane they were tracking and where this object was. So it was on the radar right over, essentially right where this target is supposed to be. But the pilot could not find anything. Not only could he not see it visually, these planes back in the day, they were equipped with radar and infrared detection equipment, and they picked up no contact in the area as well. So the control tower asked the aircraft commander of a KC-135 Stratotanker, a refueler, that was flying the area to check to see if he could see anything in the area, but they reported nothing as well. So the interceptors could find nothing when they went out there, even though they were where it happened. Supposedly it was picked up on radar, where radar was still showing it. There was nothing there to be seen. Now, this is kind of, I don't know of it. I guess maybe the GIF animation does not play. But that's, again, kind of a standard radar plane indicator. And Agent Kamako kind of drew this diagram here of what his radar scope looked like. And as you can see, the center dot is where the radar station is. That first kind of circle is a 100-mile range. And you recall they kind of picked up this target at about 95 miles. That kind of dot where I put a red circle where the UFO supposedly is. The plane takes off from this other dot. That's Minot Air Force Base, which is north of where the actual radar station is. So that's why it's not the same dot as the main center. And the plane's track kind of flies out there, and he flies these it's hard to see, but he flies these loop-de-loops around at all these different altitudes to try to see it. Search radar operator Kamako reports that this target remains continuously on his radar until he's relieved at 3 a.m. in the morning. So it's on there all night long, apparently. And except when the fighter was sent out, it was an isolated target. No other aircraft, ground clutter, or noise pips were seen within 20 miles of this target at any point during the night. This entire episode lasts about 4 hours, and it's confirmed by two other missile launch sites, Mike 4 and November 7 near Mohall. And there are several witnesses. Unfortunately, supposedly there's witness statements somewhere. They're not actually in the Blue Book files I've seen. So I just have quotes I've got from other sources, and just want to kind of just list some of the general descriptions. Some of these other witnesses at the site kind of described the incident. The descriptions of the object were as followed. One of them described it as red, greenish, yellow, white, multicolored object, changing colors from red to green to bright yellow. Another said it was red, green, yellow lights. And the guy said large white yellow ball with red on one side and green on another. Another witness stated stationary light changes from green to orange to red, or a bright green light with a flashing red or green light around it. The apparent size of the object would appear to correlate with the change in color and the intensities that were witnessed. When the object was a white or yellow-white color, it would glow in intensity and appear to be very large. When it was a red or kind of a green color, it would glow dimly and appeared very small. In fact, many of the people that were, when they reported these objects kind of dimming or going out, is when they were kind of reddish colored. These objects also seem to follow a similar pattern of movement described by the various witnesses. One witness reported that the object would brighten, move laterally a bit, then dim, move downward, disappear, reappear, and then repeat in this sequence. Another witness reported the object would increase in brightness, move, then hover, go dim, then go out, then reappear, then repeat the sequence. Others reported it basically just a glowing hovering object that would change colors and intensity and then dim and go out. So Project Blue Book and the Condon Project essentially come to the same conclusion. And it's a conclusion I mostly agree with, that the initial radar targets and the white objects seen were just the aircraft coming in at the base. And they did get kind of a list of some flights coming in. And because we don't have exact times when the strike team saw these white lights, it's hard to match up exactly, but there were some flights that came in roughly in the same time period that these people could have been seen. And if you recall, these white lights were seen directly in the direction of the landing path of the Minot Air Force Base in the distance, and that they reported you could see planes that would come in on that path from those sites. And so they figured that those white lights were just some of these planes that were coming in, and that the radar targets were either the planes or anomalous propagation, and the fact that the targets were always in the same 95-mile range, kind of like way out there, and they didn't seem to do anything. They figured that was just kind of a radar propagation issue going on. Now, the multicolored object that kind of kicked things off and initially started the sighting would be nothing more than a star. And the Condon report suggests that it could be Capella, but they do point out that if the guy's estimates that it was at 45 degrees elevation is accurate, it couldn't be Capella. But as we saw, the other guy said 40 at one point. When he pointed out the other guy was only at 20-degree elevation. So we can't really take his elevation estimates as that accurate. If it's not Capella, I still think that was almost certainly a star twinkling, and people were suffering the effects of autokinesis. If you look at those descriptions, the general descriptions I just gave you, that's textbook definition of people witnessing a star and experiencing autokinesis. Because when you stare at a star in the sky like that, and with no other background, it can appear to bob and kind of move around a little bit laterally, left and right, up and down. And it's pretty textbook star kind of sighting going on. And they concluded, both Blue Book in their kind of initial report and the Condon Project, is that like is known to happen in multiple witness sightings. The kind of excitement of one sighting sets off a group of others as people get overexcited and endow undue significance to prosaic objects that perhaps would not normally grab their attention. Now, this case did actually get a little bit of publicity. It was first published actually in the not Hynek's article, but in the Minot Daily News in December 6, 1966, in an article called Minot Launch Control Center Saucer Cited as One Indication of Outer Space Visitors. Now, they actually got the story because they referenced the Saturday Evening Post article, even though it hadn't come out yet. They had heard it was going to be published, and they went and asked the Air Force for confirmation of the story, and printed this article a little bit before Hynek's article came out. And Hynek, of course, would kind of bring the case to most people's attention in his article, Are Flying Saucers Real?, published in the Saturday Evening Post on December 30th, 1966. And he would open up the article with this case, where he gives a description pretty similar to what I just gave you guys. He says, on August 25th, 1966, an Air Force officer in charge of a missile crew in South Dakota suddenly found that his radio transmission was being interrupted by static. At the time, he was sheltered in a concrete capsule 60 feet below the ground. While he was trying to clear up the problem, other Air Force personnel on the surface reported seeing a UFO, an unidentified flying object, high in the sky. It had a bright red light, and it appeared to be alternately climbing and descending. Simultaneously, a radar crew on the ground picked up the UFO at 100,000 feet. So begins a truly puzzling UFO report, one that is not explainable as it now stands as such familiar cases as a balloon, aircraft, satellite, or meteor. When the UFO climbed, the static stopped, stated the report made by the base's director of operations. The UFO began to swoop and dive, and it appeared to land 10 to 15 miles south of the area. Missile Site Control sent a strike team, well-armed Air Force guards, to check. When the team was about 10 miles from the landing site, static disrupted radio contact with them. 5 to 8 minutes later, the glow diminished, and the UFO took off. Another UFO was visually sighted and confirmed by radar. The one that was first sighted passed beneath the second. Radar also confirmed this. This made for altitude towards the north, and the second seemed to disappear with the glow of red. This incident was not picked up by the press, as is typical of puzzling cases that I've studied during my 18 years I've served with the Air Force's scientific consultant on the problem of UFOs. So he publishes the case in that, and that kind of, brings it to most people's attention. And this is one of the few cases where we actually have like blue book files, like on one of these. A lot of these cases, we don't actually have any files or investigation, honestly, because they probably never actually happened. But I guess we'll talk about that a bit later. Raymond Fowler would kind of add on to this case and add a little bit more detail when an article would be published in the Christian Science Monitor in December 1973, titled "Air Force Sternly Denies the UFO Minuteman Incident." Now, he actually got in a little bit of trouble with his employer for this article that he was interviewed for. They kind of were mad and felt he was talking out of turn, and I guess even threatened to fire him at one point anyways. But Raymond Fowler was a project supervisor for Sylvania Corporation on a Minuteman missile program near Boston. And he was also chairman of the Massachusetts subcommittee of the National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, NICAP. And is a pretty well-known UFO investigator, well-known for bringing kind of the Kingman case. A lot of cases he was kind of like the main guy on. And he wrote several books, UFOs, Interplanetary Visitors, Case of UFO Investigator, UFO Testament. Pretty well-known UFO guy. And while he was working for Sylvania, he kind of had the opportunity to speak to some colleagues and military personnel who worked and manned these Minuteman sites in North Dakota and Montana, who would sometimes feed him UFO reports kind of related to incidents. And one of these Air Force officers that he had spoke to when he was working at Sylvania. Now, he tries to keep everyone anonymous, but it's been so many years. I'm just going to say the guy's name, Captain Hathaway, because I have his letter where he told people it anyways. So this guy, Captain Hathaway, was supposedly one of these Air Force officers in the launch control facility during this Mike 6 incident on October 25th, 1966. And they report mostly the kind of same story as we've already heard, but they kind of add some more details and get almost a bit more kind of conspiratorial about it. They report again that the officer declared that the launch control facility's radar equipment, which enabled them to receive fine instructions from coordinated receptors and transmit them to the silo launch facilities, was blocked out by static when the UFO hovered directly over it. So not too different what we already know. But this guy goes on to say that there's nothing he can conceive of on Earth that could cause the equipment to malfunction from such an altitude, emphasizing that it was working perfectly beforehand and it worked fine afterwards. Again, the only problem with that is that this object wasn't at such an altitude. It wasn't ever directly over the launch facilities. So, and from all things I've read, it's actually, and countless other cases I've seen, it's not that uncommon for this static to happen. I mean, I found several cases where they've had static issues like this. But he also added a little bit more on the case. He says he was told that not only was the static interrupted between the strike teams who were dispatched to look at this spot, but the aircraft, these intercepting aircraft, and he implies there's more than one of them. Instead of just this one F-106, there's like more than one of them. Two of them, I believe I read somewhere else. And their radars were jammed and interfered, and they couldn't be communicated with as well, which is nonsense, to be honest. Like, we've got the radar logs of the interceptor and the interceptor statements. Like, there was no break in communication. There was no jamming of the radio of the airplanes. And this guy would also tell Fowler that the Air Force supposedly swooped in and silenced everyone. And, you know, people signed NDAs, told to be quiet, never talk about this, etc. And again, as we know, this is utter nonsense. This case was in the Blue Book files. It was published in the newspaper a couple of months later. People were talking about it. In fact, if you listen to some of Robert Hastings' kind of witnesses that have come forward, at this time in Minot, UFOs were such a talking point that the security guards would literally set up chairs on the roof of the building or out front to look for UFOs, and that they talked about these UFOs all the time. So this incident was never silenced. There was never any NDAs. And this guy, I don't know. The problem with Fowler is he presents a lot of stories, usually anonymously, usually with no way to document and back them up. And many times the story, he just does not like really critically look at them or examine the evidence. So you've got to take what Fowler says and reports within a big grain of salt, and his missile stories with a big grain of salt. Now, there was one other sighting, just I'm going to wrap up here, basically the week earlier in Donnybrook. Now, Donnybrook is to the west of Mike 6. It's real close. In fact, I think it's closer than some of these other missile sites are. And this case involves Border Patrol agent Flickinger, Donald E. Flickinger, who is perhaps more well known to some people for his involvement in cattle mutilation investigations. He was well known for investigating the kind of connection to the supposed satanic rituals related to cattle mutilations, involved with the Bankston letters, or what's called the Son of Satan kind of letters, an incident where the guy that was in prison supposedly wrote a letter kind of informing them that these cattle mutilations were being done by satanic groups. And he was involved with that, but he had actually, that wasn't until the 70s when Hynek asked him to get involved with cattle mutilations. He actually had his own sighting, which I reported before, here in Washington State near the border back in 1965. And that kind of set him on this kind of path of being interested in UFOs. He would become NICAP's kind of North Dakota subcommittee kind of leader, and would investigate hundreds of UFO cases in the 60s and 70s throughout the Dakotas. But he also had his own kind of famous case, a classic case that was investigated by the Condon Committee as well, and was included in one of Hynek's books. And this happened on August 19th, 1966 in Donnybrook. And he's in the process of taking 2 prisoners back to Canada. And supposedly, as he's taking these prisoners back, he sees a silver dome disc kind of floating down the side of a hill near Donnybrook, North Dakota, about 10 feet off the ground. Now, it moves across the valley and climbs to about 100 feet, hovers over a reservoir, and then appears to land about kind of 250 feet away. This object then tilts on its edge, rises into the clouds at a high speed. Flickinger then later finds odd indentations in the field in the form of a triangle, size 10 feet. Some stones also seem to have been moved recently. Now, the Condon Project and investigators kind of believe these stones were just moved by animals, and we're not really too impressed with the indentations. But this famous sighting did happen in the area kind of the week before, and it's one of the only kind of UFO sightings at that time in the Blue Book files outside of this Minot kind of case here. Now, there are some other cases kind of in the area. There's a case that was reported in this from Richard Hall's The UFO Evidence, Volume 2, of a case that supposedly happened on March 5th, 1967, so several months later. And this is just a little over a week and a half before this Malmstrom case is supposed to happen. And as they say, on March 5th, 1967, Air Defense Command radar tracked an unidentified target descending over a Minuteman missile silo of the 91st Strategic Missile Wing at Minot Air Force Base. Base security teams quickly converged on the area and saw a metallic dish-shaped craft ringed with bright flashing lights moving slowly. The disc stopped and hovered 500 feet off the ground. As security police held their fire and watched in awe, suddenly the object began moving again and circled directly over the launch control facility. F-106 fighter interceptors were standing still on the flight line, waiting impatiently for an order from NORAD to scramble. When the order was not forthcoming, base operations decided on their own to scramble the interceptors. At that moment, the UFO climbed straight up and away at an incredible streak of speed. Now, unfortunately, like with this case, the source on it is none other than Raymond Fowler in his book, Casebook of a UFO Investigator. And we don't know any names or any other details, and there's actually no case that happened on this date in the files anywhere. I believe the nearest UFO case was like 2 or 3 days earlier, kind of near Mohala or Velva. So again, there's no evidence this case happened. We got no records for it. And if you look at it, it seems fairly similar to the case we just talked about, with just some more extraordinary details about almost firing on it, but they sent out the F-106 planes. Only this time, instead of not finding it, it evades the planes at high speed. And this isn't actually the kind of only story from the area, from the time period. There's another very similar story. There's a story told by a guy named David Shore, and he doesn't remember the exact dates either. He just says it's 1966, 1967. Again, very, very kind of similar. Only in this case, supposedly the missiles got a launch in progress indicator saying that they were going to go off. But apparently there's an error and then it didn't happen. There's another case with a guy named David Schindel that's quite well known. Again, he believes his case happened in September 1966. Now, and I thought for the longest time that he was just confusing perhaps this August 25th case. Because they're fairly similar, except for in his case, he says some missiles got shut down. And I would have thought they were the exact same case, only apparently I found references that there were Blue Book files for a sighting on September 15th, 1966, which is when his case has been tentatively dated by various listings. The only problem is those alleged files aren't actually in the Blue Book files that I can find anywhere, so I have not been able to see them. But his case happened just shortly after this, if it wasn't this case. But the weird thing is, David Schindel was assigned a Mike flight. He would have actually been one of the Air Force officers at this flight during this October 25th incident. So it's very odd to me that he doesn't seem to, he mentions this case now, but he didn't seem to remember it like originally. And even Robert Hastings is a little like confusing on whether or not they're the same cases. In fact, on his website, he implies the case we just talked about, this October 25th case, could be Schindel's case. Like, we just don't really know, because Schindel, like a lot of these guys, don't actually have any documents or evidence to support their cases. They just remembered them 30, 40 years later after hearing some of these other kind of stories. So there's a lot of stories kind of around this time period. This is one of the only cases where we actually have the documentation to say it actually happened. And I have a feeling some of these other people are kind of just remembering some of these cases that did happen and are adding some of these more fantastical elements onto it later on, because of bad memory 30, 40 years later. And that's why there's no evidence of their cases happening when they believe they happened. But there are cases that are similar, just not quite as amazing, that happened around the same time period, that I think that's what they're kind of confabulating from. But again, it's hard to say because we don't have documents from any of this stuff. I think that's where we end it. I'll give it back to you, Rachel.
So I'm going to talk about the something called the F-19, which was a sort of hypothetical look at what the stealth fighter that the US was developing back in the 1980s looked like, but it didn't really bear much resemblance to what actually was being built. So this is the F-117 stealth so-called fighter. It's actually a tactical bomber. It was used extensively in the 1991 Gulf War. It actually was first used in the operation in Panama to overthrow Manuel Noriega, but it really was much more successful in the Gulf War. But you can see it's sort of a diamond or faceted shape to deflect radar waves. And then let's go to the next one, please, Rachel. Yeah, this is the B2 built by Northrop. The F-117 was built by Lockheed Skunk Works, but this one's built by Northrop, or it was built by Northrop. There's actually a replacement for this now called the B-21 Raider. And but this one is actually the most expensive aircraft ever built, and it's got a flying wing configuration, and it uses like smooth surfaces because the computers were getting better, so they could calculate how radar waves could be deflected while still maintaining a more aerodynamic shape. And so those are the actual stealth fighters or bombers that were built. And then there's a F-19 stealth fighter, which was sort of a toy. It was actually shown in toys and video games, but this is by the Testers Model Company, which makes model aircraft. And it looks nothing like the F-117, as you can see. It's got these canards on the sides. It's got inward canted rear fins, while the F-117 has got outward canted fins. And it's got some things which were correct, like the way that they shielded the exhaust to reduce the infrared signature. But that could have been actually leaked information, or they could have known something about the program and then incorporated that into this toy design. In fact, this whole these toys were actually part of a political wrangling between the state of Nevada and the U.S. Air Force at the time. There was actually a U.S. congressman, a representative for Nevada, who, in a congressional committee, I think he actually held up one of these toy model kits, and he was complaining that these companies knew more about the stealth program than the state of Nevada did. But it wasn't really true. Let's go to the next one, where you'll see some more views of that aircraft. So so the third one on the top there, that box, it shows, I think, the rear, sort of this flat shape for the exhaust, which is kind of accurate to what the F-117 and the B-2 actually have. So that could have been some actual information that was used. And also the inward canted rear fins here that you can see, those actually were present on the Have Blue demonstrator, which was a kind of demonstrator model before the F-117 itself. And they were testing out like the stability and the digital flight control systems and stuff like that. That one actually did have inward canted rear fins, but then the production model had outward canted fins. And the basic shape is really very different to the F-117. Now you can also see in the bottom right there the exhausts, how they're sort of flat to disperse the and reduce the infrared energy. Next one, this is just another view. This is a completed F-19, looks kind of cool. And then the next picture shows a artist's depiction of the F-19. This one kind of is reminiscent, this picture is sort of reminiscent of a reconnaissance mission. And there was some speculation that the stealth platforms were being purposed for the reconnaissance mission, maybe to replace the SR-71, which was nearing its service by that time. It was briefly, the SR-71 was briefly resuscitated in the 1990s, but then it was definitively put out of service. But there was some speculation that there was a reconnaissance spy plane type mission for these stealth platforms, but that turned out not to really be true. At least as far as we know, there could be actual prototypes or even operational models which are used in that capacity, but we don't know about them. Although some drones which are used for surveillance and reconnaissance do have stealth characteristics, there's no manned aircraft with those features that we know about that's currently operational. This is a toy from the radar. What's it called? The Ring Raiders, which is a toy line, which is kind of forgotten now, but it was like action toys for kids back then. It shows an F-19 type aircraft. So these did make their way kind of into pop culture and things like that. And if you go to the next one, please. This is another possible shape that they thought was that the F-19 could have had. And this is by the Monogram toy model company. So different company, but they were making kits as well at the time. Very different. It's got this sort of inlet over the top of the aircraft. And it's got canards as well on the sides. And it's got a kind of overall very different shape. Like the wings are even swept kind of forward. And it's got inward canted rear fins, again, just like the Testers model toy. And then we've got a view of that, another view. You can see it's sort of a sleek, very long shape. This one's even more different than the Testers model compared to the F-117. So very, very different. In the next slide, you'll see this ad by L'Oreal, which was a company which made electronic warfare systems and other sort of electronic systems in conjunction with other defense contractors like Northrop, I want to say. But this was an ad, and sometimes they would put out these ads with these speculative shapes. And that might have been actually a ruse to trick people, especially the Soviets who they were competing with at the time. But it could have been to throw them off, from what actual stealth aircraft look like. So there could have been some involvement by the military or these companies to sort of throw a little bit of disinformation out into the public sphere. And then the next ad also shows an ad by Northrop and Laurel. And it's providing some information here, which is, the F-19 was never built as the F-19. Northrop built the B-2 bomber, and this looked nothing like it. So this was not the same aircraft. But again, you see this ad with this aircraft in it, which doesn't exist. It even shows like the radar visibility graph there. So the F-20 Tiger Shark is a sort of true fighter jet for like dogfights and things, air-to-air combat. And there you can see the radar cross-section. And then it's showing a duck, a bird. And then it's showing that the F-19 would have had an even lower cross-section compared to that. So, that would be classified information if they were showing that, and yet it was there in an ad. So that's a little bit weird. Of course, though, the F-117 and the B-2 have got very, very low radar cross-sections compared to other aircraft. And then the next slide shows a part of a video game that came out in 1988, F-19 Stealth Fighter. This was a PC game and IBM compatible machines back then, and very advanced game for the time. Nice graphics and a lot of sort of things you could do in it, and it had a manual as well. But again, this was not what the stealth fighter looked like. Now, more details are found in this book by Curtis Peebles. This book was, I think, originally published in 1996 or 97. It went through a couple of editions after that with some revised information, but it's a very, very good reference for these sorts of aircraft that were developed at Area 51 at the Groom Lake facility in Nevada. And that was the Groom Lake facility was really central to the wrangling between the state of Nevada and the Air Force and federal government, because the state of Nevada felt that it was being encroached upon and its rights were being trampled on by the federal government, because the Air Force kept purchasing more and more land for its own purposes. Like, it's a very hot, isolated place, and so it's ideal for weapons testing and aircraft testing. But, it does annoy a lot of people in Nevada that it's seen as a having that function for the federal government. So there was a lot of political disputes and legal claims made at the time around especially Area 51. There's actually a new book. I don't have it in these slides, but it's by Peter Merlin. It's the definitive history of Area 51, of what we know about it. I think it's called Dreamland. It's a very, very good book. But this book's also very good, by Curtis Peebles. And in this book, he also mentions that the congressman, whose name I can't remember, but he held up a toy model, I think the Testor's model, to complain that supposedly this toy model company knew more about these secret stealth programs than the elected legislature did. So this is a book from the 1980s by Doug Richardson. It's called Techniques and Equipment of Electronic Warfare. And you can purchase this on eBay for a few bucks. It's still very good. It does have some speculative pictures here about stealth aircraft, like what they could have looked like. This one's almost like a blimp, this one here. It's got like jagged edges on the bottom to deflect the radar. And here you see speculations about the F-19 up here, and then the advanced technology bomber being built by Northrop Grumman, or Northrop at the time. I don't know if Grumman had merged with it yet. But this one, it looks nothing like the B-2. The B-2 is a flying wing, but that's what they thought maybe the ATB looked like. So anyway, there's a lot of these sorts of speculative artwork type things going on in the technical literature, including Jane's Defense and other publications. So I just find all that sort of stuff interesting and how it intersects with popular culture.
Okay, it's time for Ufos Book Club. It's going to be led by Luis.
Yeah, although maybe Jeff could lead the discussion about the Robert Salas case, because he knows more about these cases, although I can just give a very brief overview of that. Well, no, you go ahead, Jeff. I'll talk about chapter 4.
Oh, I mean, I did read this chapter. Well, sort of. I had it read to me a couple of times, but I didn't really make any notes on it. Some of the abstract here, I'll read real quick. This paper discusses the numerous disconnects between the very consistent witness confirmations alleged by a single individual over an extended period of time. The case study involves an incident in which UFOs reportedly interfered with the status of nuclear missiles within multiple silos and squadrons at Malmstrom Air Force Base in the state of Montana, United States of America. These differences later proved to be the key factor proving the falsity of the claims, because they ultimately provided sufficient cause to interview all of the witnesses separately, a resolution that was impossible to assert when the case was first described due to the anonymity of the witnesses discussed. Anonymity should always provoke doubt. And that goes to what I was just saying. The problem with a lot of Raymond Fowler's, missile cases is that they're anonymous. There's no way to actually investigate any of them. There's no files. We don't even know who they supposedly were. And so we can't investigate them. But in this case, this is the more famous kind of Malmstrom Air Force Base case, where Robert Salas essentially said that he was in one of these missile kind of launch control centers when these missiles went offline. And some of the issues with this case is that his story kind of changed multiple times over the years. And one of the things a lot of people don't really know about it is that he actually recovered this from hypnotic regression. Like, until he went under hypnosis, he didn't actually have memories of this stuff. So not only is these decades later memories, these are like hypnotically recovered memories that a lot of people don't really mention or talk about. But basically, there was a real event that did happen on March 16th, 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base with Echo Flight. And in this incident, they did have all 10 missiles that went down. And it was essentially tracked to, there was like a power outage, a local power outage, I believe. And it caused like an error in the lines. And the missiles all came back online pretty quickly. They were only actually offline for something like 10 to 20 seconds. So like it wasn't like they were just gone. Like it basically was a reboot. They just cycled like this to happen. So these systems apparently back in the day, this happened actually quite frequently. That when they have local power interruptions and problems, they would have to switch over to a backup generator system like that would have, and it would kick in pretty quickly. Like I said, it was just kind of like a reboot or recycle, and things would be running again. And so back in March 16th, there was a shutdown at Echo Base that did happen. It's in the records, and we have the files for it. But there's no real evidence that a UFO was involved in that incident. Now, when Robert Salas came out with his case, he initially thought it was that event of 10 missiles going down. And so he kind of initially tied himself to that story. Now, he eventually kind of figured out that he wasn't on duty or something at Echo Flight, on these days. So it could not have been that case. He eventually ends up changing his story at least a couple of times. At one point, he said he said he was on November flight, but then that didn't work out, and he had to change his story again to Oscar Flight that he was actually really at. Now, he then had to change the story from being when this real event happened at Echo Flight on March 16th to March 24th. And the reason he did that is because that's the only place they could find an actual UFO case that happened around the time period. And some 50 miles distant in Belt, Montana, there was somebody reported a UFO sighting. And so he figured they kind of had to be the same time. So he moved his case date to now March 24th, 1967, instead of March 16th, when we know missiles really did shut down. Only the kind of one of the like I say is that there's no documentation his event ever happened, and the idea that there was a shutdown basically in the same place at one of the other flights of all 10 missiles like a week before his incident just doesn't really work. And one of the other problems is that he supposedly claims that his case was confirmed by the people that he worked with. Only problem is like one of the guys that confirmed the story confirmed all like 3 versions of the story. He said, yep, that's absolutely right every single time. But the story changed every single time. So how can he confirm the story as being accurate each time it changed? So the thing with Salas is, like I think I mentioned with a lot of these people, is that I think he probably remembers this real kind of this Echo Flight incident that happened. And over the years, he kind of, and after hearing UFO stories and other things, he's kind of confabulated on that, like, he believed that this happened to him. And then when the details really didn't work out to match with this incident, he just started to hone and change the details over the years until, he came up with a case that he now presents that he was at Oscar Flight. Oscar Flight lost 10 missiles. Only, like I said, there's no evidence to back up any of this. And he did change his story multiple times. So not only does he change his story, this article kind of points out that they're kind of dishonest in the way they present their story as well. They kind of ignore a lot of the documentation and the evidence that would kind of throw doubt on these stories. They, for example, like when they looked at, I believe, the base history used to kind of like look up for these incidents, like they kind of like cherry pick out certain parts of it that kind of help sell their version of events, while kind of not including the rest of the base histories that they got that kind of would, throw cold water all over the version of the story they're trying to sell. Now, one of the other interesting things kind of about this case that should be pointed out is the guy that wrote this article, James Carlson. His father was Eric Carlson, who was actually the missile commander that was basically Salas's kind of boss at the time, right? And so this article kind of debunking this case, and this guy also wrote a very good long form kind of booklet called Echo Flights of Fancy as well, where he talks about the issues with this case. And because his father was directly involved, he talked to a lot of the same kind of people. And we come to find out that a lot of the stuff on these cases that are being put forward by people like Robert Salas and Robert Hastings kind of like actually contradicts what these people actually told people, or even what's in the letters themselves, right? Like in this article, there's a place where they kind of show a letter that this guy, Mywald, who was, I believe, with Salas, wrote to him, and it kind of tells a different story than what Salas then tells people this whole time, what Mywald says. So this is where you kind of got to really go back and look at these cases. And I highly kind of recommend looking at that Echo Flights of Fancy book that was also written. You can kind of think of it as like this paper, only a lot more in depth on the case and the various issues. And I'd also recommend the work of a guy named Tim Hebert, who has a blog called Did It Really Happen?, where he breaks down these. And he is known as a skeptic, but he's an informed skeptic because he was actually a SAC missileer who actually worked in these launch facilities like in Malmstrom. And so he's very familiar with equipment and what's going on and the people, and he's talked to the people. And he kind of explains a lot of the many issues with this case. And unfortunately, I think this happens not just with this case, but it's happened with a lot of these cases. These guys have later on, and a lot of these witnesses actually say like they saw Robert Hastings on TV or on a TV special talking about UFOs and nukes, and they decided to then come out like, with the story, or they are like, that made me think about something that I think happened way back when. So a lot of these guys, like, they're only coming out decades later after they've already kind of heard these UFO stories, and their stories tend to be sometimes very similar to events that really happened, just a bit more, kind of fantastical, and they kind of add stuff onto it. David Schindler's another guy that's kind of honed his story like over the years. If you look at his original letters that he wrote to Robert Hastings, he says that he's unsure. Kind of the missiles go down, maybe only a couple of them are affected, but he's kind of unsure. To now, if you listen to him talk in the Citizen Hearings Disclosure in his book, it was 10 missiles that got shut down, and he's got all the details. And so these guys, like, they start off with vague memories of these events, and then kind of through confabulation and then like hearing these other stories tend to add and build onto them. Unfortunately, there's no real evidence a lot of these events happen. There's no files. All these guys claim that they signed NDAs and the cone of silence was put on them and they can't talk about it. And in this case, actually, about NDAs, like Robert Salas claims, they were told they couldn't talk about it. Well, they actually talked to the people that his kind of base commander and whatnot. And he said, that's nonsense. Like, the OSI never came and investigated. There was no NDAs anyone had to sign. So all these people, they all have very similar stories. They all claim they were told to keep secret and told to keep silent. They signed NDAs. Only, as we've seen, that's bogus. They were never signed NDAs. Most of these people, their events likely never even happened. There was a real Echo flight shutdown. There was not an Oscar flight shutdown. Robert Salas's event never happened.
And also, didn't Salas at that press club that was formed by Stephen Greer back in the day? I think, was it Stephen Greer, or it was somebody at a press club?
Well, there's the citizen hearings, disclosure hearings that were like in 2013 that were done that even Corbell had some involvement with. But yeah, there's the original ones. And then there was a more recent one that they also did, I think 2021 or something, where Salas was at. And David Schindler was also at.
In the earlier one, Salas was presenting these documents, which he was trying to pretend were declassified, or that he was leaking them. But in fact, they'd already been declassified like years later. He just changed the cover. Yeah,
they were declassified like in 1979 or something like that. Like, as just the part of normal standard declassification process. Like, there was nothing really secret or classified like about them.
And yet he still like had details on that new cover that he put, which made it clear that this was a long ago declassified document, which sort of shows like a level of contempt for, the people listening to him. The other thing was, what was the company that was in charge of like the systems at that base? Was it General Dynamics or something?
There was Boeing.
Boeing.
An engineer, I believe his name was Kaminsky. I think with Boeing, that was one of the people that investigated the fault system.
Yeah.
There was another company. I'm drawing a blank on it, but I think you might be talking about Boeing. Yeah. So and like I say, it was a fault that just kind of happened, and all these guys make a big deal like, these are our secure military systems. This stuff does not happen like at all. Like these systems don't go down. Like only actually they do. In fact, from what I've read, it wasn't uncommon for at least a few missiles to be down at a time, and they also kind of regularly had issues with these power systems and like power faults and problems, and then things needing to be reset. I think a lot of people tend to think our equipment is more reliable than it really is. Like, I'll point out, like, they would brag that their uptime was 95% on the Minuteman missiles. So that meant 5% of the time there was missiles down. So there's always missiles that are going down. What's uncommon is for 10 to go down at a time. And the only time we have proof of that is the Echo flight incident. That was pretty rare, but they were able to figure it out.
Yeah, and it never happened again, apparently.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like in one of those conferences, they talk about how they kind of speculate on, did the Air Force fix the system to prevent these UFOs from doing it? Like, no, I don't think these UFO sightings has anything to do with it. It was just common problems in the systems as they upgraded. Like, systems need upgraded. Like our radar commonly had lots of issues. One of the reasons they upgraded the radar at Minot and elsewhere was because like Project Lamplight with the MIT Lincoln Lab kind of determined a lot of the old SAGE radar systems being used in the 1950s, where we get a lot of these great radar cases, supposedly great radar cases of these fast moving objects, had a lot of serious issues. They were quite easy to spoof and to create problems and false targets and all sorts of issues. And that's why they upgraded to these, what was called frequency diversity radars that they used in the 60s. But even those, were kind of older systems. So all these systems are kind of old and they had issues. They weren't perfect. And it doesn't mean a UFO is involved. And in this case, there's no evidence of a UFO being involved in the shutdowns.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they changed one of the couplers or something, and they didn't happen again, really. So it wasn't an issue.
So you mentioned a cone of silence. I was kind of wondering, is there actually like an official cone of silence? Like, when you go to the Pentagon, do they like give you a cone or something to wear on your head or something like that?
It's one of those dog cones that you put on your neck so you don't chew yourself.
Yeah. Robert Salas needed one of those.
And one of the books I actually used in my research was Salas's kind of first book with James Klotz, who is talked about a lot in this paper by Carlson, Fated Giant, because he kind of opens up the book talking about this Minot case I just talked about, but it's mostly about like the Malmstrom and other cases. But yeah, then it's also covered, of course, in these UFOs and nukes books by Robert Hastings, Volume 1, Edition 1, Second edition. So, there's lots of these cases. Only, like I say, a lot of them we just don't have paperwork or documents to. And in the case of this is really probably the most famous event, the Robert Salas event that was even brought up in the UAP, that first congressional hearing on UFOs. They kind of bring up his incident of this kind of red dot above the silos or whatever. But sadly, like I said, there's not only is there no evidence to support it, I think the evidence is quite strong. It never happened. I think, people like James Carlson and whatnot, and others like Tim Hebert have quite clearly laid out that he's confusing the real Echo flight incident for his Oscar flight incident. And I would argue not only that, I would go even farther to say that they're being dishonest about it. Like, they're not just confused, they're kind of intentionally misleading to promote their own narrative of the case. So,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who he cites as supposedly corroborating his story, they're dead now.
They don't. Yeah. Oh, yeah, they're dead. So one, we can't talk to them. And even some of those people like Mywald and whatever that other guy's name was, supposedly actually don't corroborate his story. So like they just kind of cherry pick parts out to use as corroboration. But because they're dead, we can't go back and say, well, they're saying you don't think this, you think something else. Can you confirm? Like, but they're dead, so there's no one to defend it.
Good documentary movie called What They Don't Want You to Know About UFOs by Brian Dunning.
Yeah.
And there's a part there about the Salas case, and they talk to a former missile man.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's asking him like, you know, does this shutdown sound like something which would happen, you know, without a UFO?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that guy did a pretty good job of laying out the problems with like the case, and that's the thing too, is like Hastings will say, I've got all these witnesses and experts, you know, that back up my UFO and nukes narrative. Like, but like then people like Tim Hebert, who was also like a missile commander, you know, and will say that he's got also hundreds of people that will say this stuff's nonsense. So, I mean, yeah, you can always find people that, the other thing, like I said, I thought was so crazy about some of this is that how they talk about how they're told to keep quiet, not to talk about this, like this was kept silent and it was secretive, and they made to sign NDAs. But I don't see how that can be, because then you hear all these other stories about how like UFOs were the talk of the base, and they were talking about this stuff nonstop, like it was all everyone was talking about all the time, and they used to joke about it all the time. In fact, I heard that it was actually a joke at Malmstrom. People used to joke that, oh, I see a UFO out there. I see a UFO out there. Like people used to pull people's legs like doing that. So, I mean, this idea that like the government came up and silenced these incidents, I don't think has any credibility. Like, I think these people are just confusing things. And even people like David Schindel will say that like, it's almost like my memory's blank of what else happened that day. I just don't remember anything else after that event. And they told us to stay silent. Like they really play up this kind of like conspiratorial cover up kind of angle that just there's no evidence for, and based on and a lot of counter evidence that was nonsense, because people were talking about this stuff like all the time. So yeah, it's weird. I just don't think that, I'm not convinced that there's really a real connection between UFO sightings and nuke bases and military bases. I think a lot of the statistical studies people have tried to do to try and come up with a correlation have a lot of like issues. Like for one, there's many reasons why people might be watching the sky in these areas more, because they're military facilities, and you know people are on more alert, and so they might see things more. And the other issue is sightings don't mean UFOs. Just because people report seeing stuff doesn't mean there was actually a UFO there monitoring anything. So I'm not really convinced of the connection. Plus, you've also just got the fact that the vast majority of the U.S. is within so many miles of a military base or facility of some kind, right? Like, so most of the U.S. is nearby some sort of military facility out there. So.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jeff, but there's someone in the chat named Kenneth Vitato who is claiming that they were there for a UFO incident in 1975 when UFOs crossed the dew line. Just wanted to comment on that. Does anyone have a response to Kenneth here?
I mean, like I say, there was a lot of sightings kind of in mid 1970s, like as well. Like there is some like the Pine Tree Radar Network sightings. I'm not familiar with that exact event. I don't know if that event that he's talking about is in the literature at all or not. But
okay, well, I guess we'll have to look into
it.
Yeah.
See if I can figure anything else out.
Yeah, and the next one is about abductees. So this guy, Peter Huston, who is an author, he's written some books about like UFO and paranormal scams. And he's gone to conferences and things like abductee conferences. So he talks about his experiences, admittedly anecdotal, but still he conveys what impressions he had about Betty Hill, Richard Price, and attending a Bud Hopkins Foundation or Intruder Foundation conference for abductees, people who think that they were abducted by aliens. And he's just basically giving his impressions of these people. So he starts off with the Hill case, or Betty Hill, because he visited her. She was already quite old by then, but he found her to be very pleasant and friendly, and he liked her a lot. But she was saying some really far out stuff. She had started, or I guess way even before that, she had started to believe that she was seeing UFOs everywhere, especially in New Hampshire. And basically, she was just seeing street lights and lights in the sky. But she was being fireflies.
Yeah, I think she saw. I think there's cases where people were with her, and she's like, "These are UFOs," and like, "Those are fireflies."
Yeah. But yeah, she was quite gullible in that respect. Yeah. And oddly enough, she came to very much doubt hypnotic regression, except when it came to her. She said that Dr. Simon, was that his last name or his first name? But it was the guy who
Benjamin Simon.
Simon did the hypnotic regression on her and Barney. Barney, her husband, her late husband, was dead by then, but she was still promoting the story. But Dr. Simon, she claimed, was doing something called medical hypnosis, which is apparently not an actual thing. And she says that he wasn't, nobody was doing that anymore. And that he is the author of this piece in Betty's home in 1998. And that little model there, by the way, that little bust is a model of the supposed alien that she encountered on the spacecraft that abducted her and Barney.
Creepy.
Yeah, so he wasn't very impressed with her testimony because, obviously there's problems with hypnotic regression, but also Betty just seemed like a kind of gullible, fantasy-prone person. And that's a major issue when we're thinking about UFO cases and also, abduction cases or close encounters of the third kind, especially, that there's some sort of fantasy wish fulfillment or some sort of just delusion or even hallucination going on. So we have to watch out for that. And then the next person that he talked to was Richard Price. Let me just scroll down to Richard Price Sr., who was a major pusher of UFO abduction stories because he claimed that he himself was or had been abducted by aliens, and that he had an implant which actually moved down, according to him, into his penis. But it was determined to be basically just something that he had ingested into his urethra, and then it had like a connective tissue sheath which formed around it. So this is quite common that people will, absorb things into their skin, including metal from the environment. We probably do this all the time without noticing. But then sometimes, people think that they find like a little mark on their skin or a bump or something or a rash, and they think that it's proof that they were actually abducted. So there's many psychosomatic responses that people can have to stress or to these sorts of stories, but we can also get, small injuries and things in our everyday lives. Doesn't mean that we're
that have gotten micrometeorites that end up inside of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that would be an extraterrestrial object. So
yeah,
I mean, you're not necessarily going to know if you get impacted by a tiny, small little thing that gets put into your skin.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
There's people that get shot and don't even notice at first. So,
well, they get some of the, what is it, buckshot, or they don't get directly hit, but like some of the splinters from the bullet get into them.
Yeah.
But Richard Price, apparently he had major emotional difficulties. He had been apparently married twice and divorced twice. One of his wives had committed suicide and had been extremely jealous of other women. Like, she would even cut out, pictures of women from magazines if he was reading them, and turn off the TV if a woman appeared, because she was
listening to music. Yeah, she said he couldn't listen to music because he might fall in love with the woman.
Yeah,
it sounds like my first girlfriend in high school, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I wouldn't survive because I'm in love with Stevie Nicks. But yeah,
Yeah, this
so
guy's
this
homeless, basically. He's a
yeah, he
homeless.
was homeless, and he met a woman who was like a new age type person, and she had helped him with some stuff and introduced him to this skeptical organization in New York who was doing sort of public lectures at libraries and things like that for the benefit of the public to learn more about science and how to be skeptical. And there was some discussion about whether to include him in give him like the ability, the chance to do like a guest lecture, but they decided against that, and that it would actually be exploitative if they did let him do it because it would be seen as sort of bad faith. Like, here is a believer, and maybe people would see that as not good because he's sort of an extreme case of like emotional difficulty, and so are we just using him to paint all experiences or abductees in this light? So it was decided that they wouldn't have him on. Plus, there was a woman who was not interested in hearing about his penis, so that was another thing. So yeah, that case wasn't very impressive. Or didn't impress the author of this article because obviously this man had severe emotional difficulties, and that was probably. And he'd actually apparently spent some time in a mental hospital previously.
And these
As well.
people in these groups were like having to like give him food and like pay for like room and board for him because like I say he was basically homeless and they kept having to get people from this new age and other groups like would donate money to him to kind of help him live
Yeah.
because he didn't really have any income and yeah
Mhm.
it's a weird guy.
And also, well, yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to say about that case. And then the third case that he looked at was when the author went to a UFO conference in Queens in New York City, hosted by Bud Hopkins Intruders Foundation. This was in the year 2000. And only about 200 people showed up, and it was mostly believers, and a lot of them were probably themselves so-called abductees. John Mack, Nick Pope, and Bruce Maccabee apparently were also present. So some big names in ufology were present, but it was a disappointingly low turnout. In any case, he got to speak to a lot of people there, get their impressions. Some VHS tapes were on sale, including Bud Hopkins' Hidden Memories, a UFO abductee, and Omega Communications presents the UFO Experience, which was a lecture by Roger Lear, a podiatric surgeon and firm advocate that not only were alien abductions taking place, but aliens were leaving implants in people.
Yep.
And so, yeah, so, a lot of people here were sort of encouraging each other in these beliefs. And the author was noting that it's quite dangerous to tell, especially children, like if they're having nightmares, which apparently Bud Hopkins saw as enough evidence to think that somebody was being abducted by aliens, as if children don't have nightmares or imagine monsters under their bed. But
Yeah.
Bud Hopkins was encouraging people to believe that children should be, you know, taken to or be believed when they say that they are seeing monsters, bona fide monsters, instead of just imagining them. So that's pretty dangerous.
Yeah.
And people just sort of seizing upon hypnotic regression, especially Hopkins, who was not himself medically trained. He didn't have any medical or psychology accreditations. He was an abstract artist, and he was pretty successful at that. But when he got into the UFO scene, he started to sort of really adopt this anti-scientific view that he could just sort of take people's words at face value. And of course, with hypnotic regression, there's all kinds of problems about leading the witness, introducing false elements into a story.
Mm-hmm.
And and there's also hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations, false memories, sleep paralysis. These can all play into abduction themes as well.
Well, I'll mention one of Hopkins' abductees that I believe went by the name Beth in one of his books, that supposedly was like abducted and impregnated by these aliens. And then the alien was, the baby was taken away, this hybrid baby was taken away. It turns out the whole story was bogus. Beth created it to hide the fact that she was raped and having an incestuous baby that they then aborted or whatever. And they didn't, and she didn't want to deal with that trauma. And so she told this alien abduction story to kind of cover up the fact that she had an abortion from an incestuous child because she was raped. And so, not only do you have false memories, you have people that are literally covering up trauma with memories of, abductions, or they feel that it would be easier to be an abductee that supposedly he had a hybrid child than to admit the fact that they were raped and had to get an abortion.
Yes.
So, and Hopkins was was not a very critical researcher. He just kind of believed anything people told him.
Even an ex-wife of his
who
filmed him basically, doing his work, and she was asking him questions, and she was sort of starting to catch on that he was not being objective at all.
Yeah.
And she even said that she like shared or tried to share scientific discoveries with him from like the world of astronomy, and he basically didn't care.
Yeah, and you could forgive him to an extent because he was an artist, and honestly, he should have stayed an artist. I actually like some of his paintings. Like, I actually think he did some kind of cool, kind of minimalist, kind of cool paintings. But and people like John Mack, though, weren't really any better, despite all of his training. He still was leading witnesses. He still, was using hypnotic regression and not really understanding the issues involved. And so a lot of these guys, and there's these conferences, I believe they called the Treat conferences, that were kind of about these abductees and researchers. And there was like a big controversy over like the use of hypnotic regression by amateurs, like Bud Hopkins and whatnot, that really were not trained professionals. They were not, counselors or psychologists or professionally trained in hypnosis, and how it's not really ethical. And there was a controversy over the charging the money too. Like, can you charge money? Because some of these people were, getting paid. And so, yeah, there's a lot of controversy over that. Personally, I'm convinced hypnotic regression should not be used to establish kind of a narrative or a version of events or whatnot. Yes. I think perhaps there's maybe limited usability in trying to help bring out some memories, but then that would have to be verified with actual information. Like, I don't think you can base stories strictly on hypnotic regression, because many times they turn out to be completely false. Or if, like you say, you actually see the transcripts or listen to the session by these people like Hopkins and Mack and other people, you can see where they're kind of leading them with questions. Like, and you've got to pay attention to it. Like, most like people that are kind of, more on the less critical side, don't even notice it, but you can see where they're like, and tell me about the craft. Well, like, who says it was a craft runner? Like, these beans, what did they do to you after? It's like, well, who says there's beans? Like they ask these really kind of almost subtle leading questions that, like, if you really pay attention, you can see, they're kind of leading these witnesses in the directions that they want to go. And yeah, it's wild.
I also kind of feel like there's a certain element of like that maybe like on a, because when you're in a suggestible state, then you're kind of your mind, I think, might be kind of going, oh, well, I'm supposed to do this sort of, in more of a cooperative way, so it's much easier to lead a witness because they're almost like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to be giving these sorts of answers, or I'm supposed to be remembering this type of narrative.
And all these guys kind of had their kind of, like David Jacobs and Mack and Hopkins, kind of all had their kind of, narrative and version of like the abduction scenario, what's going on with it. And they all kind of leaded their witnesses in the ways that kind of confirmed their own kind of beliefs about the phenomenon already. So, yeah, it's Yeah.
It's still interesting to think about, like, what is the social anxiety that's driving these stories. Like, even though, like, the so-called practitioners of hypnotic regression in these cases are, pushing false stories, and they're getting their patients to confabulate and basically make up a story. Like, what is the motivation for that at their personal level? There could be something to do with in the culture or in society, like fear of technology, or something to do with human existence.
Yeah. I mean, there's.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's. I think I have a hard time with interpreting things in that way, because I think. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble putting my thoughts together. Go ahead, Jeff.
I mean, I just gonna say there's been papers kind of written about how it's like some of these, like the abduction narratives kind of like mirror our fears of, like, after the during the atomic era, back in the 50s, 60s, the Cold War, we were all worried about, atomic bombs, nukes and whatnot. But then kind of things started to change with the development of like medical and biological engineering and technology and genetics. And we started to be more concerned about, things like that. And that's kind of, people have theorized that's mirrored in kind of the abduction narrative, which typically involves things like hybridization, of two species, and things like, the concept of the other. We're seeing the other in the aliens. And I mean, there's all sorts of other people have talked about it being related to kind of racial anxieties and tracing back to kind of colonial slavery kind of narratives of where people were abducted out of Africa. And so, I mean, there's lots of people and kind of papers that have been kind of written trying to tie or correlate the abduction phenomenon to various kind of fears and anxieties that people are experiencing. But I don't know. I think that may be true in various cases, but each case you kind of got to look at on its own basis, because I don't think that's necessarily happening in all the cases. Like, a lot of people with the Hill case kind of almost get angry, the implication that there was kind of some sort of racial connotations or motives or inspiration kind of behind it, and how it was really just kind of anxieties over an interracial marriage and a relationship in a time period where, it was not all that accepted. And I believe I remember with the Hill case, there was actually an incident on the drive where they were harassed on the road by some, racist people in a truck or whatever. So it's like, it could be connected, but at this point, we'll never really know, like, if that's what was going on.
Yeah, there is a paper. I'll have to share it somewhere once I find it, but it basically, talks about abduction narratives in the larger context of Africans being abducted into slavery. And what I found really interesting about that paper is that he isn't trying to he's not trying to provide a cause for the abduction narrative, but he's just showing how you can't really understand the abduction narrative without also looking at and acknowledging the existence of these other earlier abduction narratives in Western culture. And I mean, when you examine, the historical accounts of people being abducted into slavery from Africa, you can't really look at alien abduction narratives in quite the same way, I feel.
And plus, there's also, just as Eddie Ballard has pointed out, a long tradition of these supernatural traditional kidnapping narratives, with all sorts of other kind of supernatural creatures like the Fae, So
there's also abduction narratives around wild men and like Sasquatch type characters.
Yeah, so long before UFOs, there was this long tradition of these supernatural kidnapping narratives, and it's just kind of almost been kind of replaced with it's aliens now doing the kidnapping, instead of the Fae or the wild men or gnomes or whoever is doing the kidnapping of the.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting too because we've just talked about like a bunch of different types of abduction narratives, and some of them like being abducted by apes or being abducted by wild men have more like overt sort of racist overtones, and there's also the abductions by demons as well, which is connected somewhat to possession and also probably in some ways related to fairy lore too. And I remember reading Jacques Vallée talked about this. I don't remember where. It might have been in like Revelations or something like that. But he's basically comparing like how people, including experts and stuff like that in like 17th century America, were talking about witches and comparing that to the science of abduction in the 1990s.
Yeah.
I don't really have a point there. It's just kind of rambling about it.
Yeah, I'd recommend checking out Thomas Ballard's paper, UFO Abduction Reports, The Supernatural Kidnap Narrative Returns in a Technological Guise. And, you can kind of argue that that's kind of what the whole UFO topic is. It's just kind of like a repeat of things that people have seen in the skies always, just kind of repainted with the new modern technological guise kind of to it. We see things and interpret them, in the context of things we're familiar with from our time period. So that's, why we see the kinds of craft we do now. They saw airships back then. Maybe abductions are the same kind of situation where it's just the similar kind of like, supernatural kidnap narratives that always existed, just kind of reinvented with the technological guise.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, Operation High Jump, it's nothing like what Kenneth is describing. I'll probably do an episode or in a future episode, I'll do a piece about high jump, but I've looked into that and it's got nothing to do with UFOs. It's getting
there's that video.
Out of proportion.
Yeah, I don't want to be rude to Kenneth or anything, and Kenneth is being very civil, but we definitely are not. We are very skeptical here. It's really important to realize that. So it's
high jump gets tied in. It's the whole Admiral Byrd, Hollow Earth stuff. Yeah. So
yeah, it would be great. I mean, if you want to talk about that right now, that would be great. But or it might be better just to do a whole piece on it sometime. It's an interesting story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So are we done with book club?
Yep.
Okay.
I think so. I just wanted to say I did also find it very weird how, like I mentioned, Betty Hill was quite skeptical about everyone else's UFO encounters except her own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
she was very critical about other abductees, and thought many of them were just frauds. But her, she was certain of. But anybody else, nah. So,
it's a very
Mm-hmm.
telling sentiment, I feel like. Okay. And for our final story, a great horned owl was caught in a soccer net in University Place. On Monday, a group of brothers playing soccer discovered a great horned owl stuck in a soccer goal net in University Place, which is on the Puget Sound in Washington State, near Tacoma. The boys and their parents, Andy and Jenna Daly, rescued the owl after placing a towel over them to keep them calm. They named the owl Eleanor. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not necessarily those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or the other hosts. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel, though that channel is cursed. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, and save your soul. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he doesn't make any money off of it. He is the master of disclosure ceremonies. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. Thank you, Jeff.
Can I add one thing real quick?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that because these cases have not happened yet, as far as today's date is the 18th, I have not posted them to Twitter yet. So tonight I'll be posting that Donnybrook case, and on the 24th I'll be posting this Minot case I just covered today. So you'll be able to see all the sources and everything within a few days. You just have to hang in there. I just wanted to do this case a little early because it kind of has similarities with other missile man cases. So, yeah.
Right. Thank you, Jeff. Oh, shoot. Hold on. Just give me a second here. I'm having technical.
By the way, do you want to hear a great horned owl?
Yes, please. That is what it sounds like.
This is a book that's got like a electronic thing that you can look up the bird. It's got like the number, and then like you punch in the number here, and it gives you the sound.
What book is it?
Bird Songs, 250 North American Birds in Song.
That's awesome. Cool. I like it.
I would open that up and hack it and replace the audio files with something else. And so when you're playing an owl, it actually says, Luis Elizondo, buy my autographed book, imminent.
Yeah, I've heard great horned owls in real life because I saw one last year, most recently, in South Portland by Oaks Park, and that's exactly what it sounded like. It was sitting in a tree, and all these people were gathered around looking at it, and it was just sort of offering its wisdom.
I don't know what kind of owl it was, but I saw when I had those green fireball sightings down by Vancouver Lake, there was an owl just kind of on a tree post, kind of like just next to me, just kind of looking down at me the whole time, like watching me. So maybe it was an alien spaceship and the owls were the screen memory because I was abducted by the green fireball. We'll never know, but I saw an owl and a green fireball in the same night, same place.
I also saw a barred owl a few times. I've seen barred owls here in Portland, and the barred owl, that's B-A-R-R-E-D. One of them actually attacked me one time in the park when I was walking around at night, but fortunately I was wearing a hat because it like grabbed onto my head and then flew off. And then another barred owl was actually stalking me, and so it was fortunate that I saw the owl. Like it flew over my head, did the sort of Mothman thing, completely silent, but I saw the silhouette in my upper peripheral vision. And so I like immediately turned on my cell phone light, and I was able to locate the owl, and it was in fact a barred owl. I'll try to find the images of that sometime for you.
I only get stalked by crows, and that's because they're psychopaths.
Crows have stalked me too. They're crazy.
Yeah. They remember you and they hold grudges like forever. So
I've had in Seattle years back, there were crows. They would just follow me and caw at me and like lunge at me, like, I don't know, maybe they thought I was a red-tailed hawk or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you,
everybody.
Amy. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for joining, Kenneth. And
Swink, at least at the beginning.
Swink. Hi, yeah. Swink. Thanks for stopping by. Thank you to Kevin and Ben. Please also consider supporting Jeff's Ko-Fi, if you don't want to become a patron, by the way.
Yeah, I believe it's just UFO history. ko-fi.com/UFO history. So,
Okay. Yeah. Sounds right.
cool. Sounds good.
All right. And in the words of the disc, I bring you a warning. Every one of you, listen to my voice. Tell the world. Tell this to everybody, wherever they are. Watch the sunset. Everywhere. Keep looking. Don't stare directly at it, but at all times, keep watching the sunset.
I always stare at the sun. It's good for you.